Hello everybody. We're happy to see so many people here. Today we have here Bernd-Christian Otto, who is a fellow at the Goethe Hamburg colleague at the Bochum University and an associated fellow at the Max Weber Center in Erfurt, and he has published several books on magic in Western history and otherwise, and he will hold 3 lectures. First of which is today, next one is tomorrow, and the third one is on Friday, about different topics related to magic. I'll hand it over to you. Oh, and one more thing. I'll send this around, everybody sign it. Very important.
Okay. Thank you, Indrek. Hello, everybody. Tere. Tere means hello in Estonian. I just learned that. So first of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. And as Indrek just said, I will give 3 lectures on 3 different topics or aspects of magic. And today I will present you a lecture about a collection of magical manuscripts which sit in the University Library of Leipzig. But before doing that, I would be interested in knowing who of you has any pre-knowledge about grimoires or European magical texts. Maybe raise your hand just so that I have some understanding. Okay, and who has any knowledge about magic of any form? Oh, good. Who has practical knowledge? Oh, okay. Good. So, today's lecture is called Western Learned Magic in a Nutshell, the Leipzig collection of Codices Magici. And first, I will introduce myself. Then I will give a brief explanation of why this collection is interesting or important. And then I will, in the middle part, try to explain what this collection is part of, namely what I call Western Learned Magic. I will try to explain that category to you and maybe ask you whether you think it's a plausible category. Then I will briefly go into the history of this collection and show you some of the contents of the collection. It's 140 manuscripts in total, so it's a really huge collection of magical books from around 1700s. And finally, I will give you some pictures. There are many drawings in these books, and pose some questions which we might discuss together. So, first of all, me. Indrek just said that I wrote a few books on magic in Western history, which is correct. That's my first book. It's my PhD thesis. It is basically a conceptual history of the term magic. So I traced the history of the term from antiquity to today. This is not what the present lecture is about. It's old stuff. This is another book I made. This is more about definitions of magic, whether they work or not, and how one could solve various riddles which surround this term. It's a complicated term. But I will also not go into this today. No definitions, no theories, just material. I will present you material. And the material I present today is gathered in my recent book. This is from 2017. It's called Magical Manuscripts in Early Modern Europe. And in this book, it's rather a narrow book. You find a description of all the manuscripts which I will present today. So the entire collection is outlined in this book in an appendix where each manuscript is described. So if you're interested in that, you can either buy this book, which is much too expensive, or you could write me an email and I could maybe send you a PDF or something. Feel free to do so. So first of all, why is this particular collection interesting or special? I think it's one of the largest collections of manuscripts of what I call learned magic. So it's not folk magic, it's not illiterate magic, it's written stuff. That's why I call it learned. It's not only written, it's complex, it's complicated. You need a lot of language expertise and a lot of knowledge on how to perform rituals in this particular art. That's why I call it learned magic. And usually such manuscripts, I mean, you can imagine all this stuff was forbidden, it was prosecuted. So a lot of material is lost, we could imagine. Or some single manuscripts have survived in small quantities. Sometimes in a library you find this manuscripts or a few, but not 140, not such a huge cohesive collection. There are other large collections in some libraries, but usually these have been assembled over time by the library. In the case of this collection, it was owned by one person, a completely unknown Paracelsian medic from the 17th century, and he bought this collection and sold it. So he assembled the entire collection. And the collection is also one of the first German collections. So from these 140 manuscripts that were sold in 1710, 113 were translated into German, which is very early. So usually you would assume that the stuff is still in Latin at that time. And there are other collections, for instance, John Dee, Edward Sloane, other early modern figures, particularly British, some French people. Also, they assembled collections, but they were usually in Latin. And so this collection is also interesting because so much is in German, and it shows that this ritual art was vernacularized in German-speaking Europe, maybe also including Estonia, I don't know, much earlier than we thought so far. And this is due to Paracelsus and particularly German milieus at the time. I will come to that later. This collection is also interesting because it's one of the most complete and systematic collections that focus on conjuring spirits. So you all know, like, modern fantasy series or magic series such as Magicians or what else is there. And you see these circles on the ground with pentagrams and people uttering conjurations. And this is what this collection is about, but it's real, it's not fantasy. So most of these manuscripts show in detail how you can conjure demons and angels or spirits or other types of beings. So most of these manuscripts are focused on this very illegal stuff at that time. And the collection also shows that this art was much more complex and versatile than we thought so far, because no one has really looked into this in the 17th, 18th centuries. We might just imagine that it's all a fantasy. There was no demon conjuration at all. But there was, and there are many manuals, and this collection is like the biggest collection of such manuals. And I think the collection even hosts many texts which are lost, and they survive here in German translations. And finally, the collection is completely transmitted. So 95% of the manuscripts that were sold in 1710 are sitting there today in the University Library of Leipzig. Only 5 manuscripts are lost, and 7 have been amended in the meantime. So today there are 142 manuscripts subsumed under the category Codices Magici. Codices Magici. In 1710, this categorization, of course, did not exist. And as the collection was compiled by a specialist, so someone who was a practitioner, the collection shows like the very nature of this tradition, which I will try to explain a bit later, namely that it is really a tradition of knowledge, of ritual knowledge basically, how to perform rituals, which endures from antiquity to today, but today we will only look at its state in 1710, which is the date of appearance of this collection. Tomorrow I will talk about modern stuff, so what do contemporary magicians do? Today we will look about early 18th century. But these manuscripts, they have ritual texts from antiquity, from the Middle Ages, from Jewish, from Arabic stuff, so it's really a very complex and longue-durée tradition. Any questions so far?
Have you seen them all?
Yes.
Not you.
I looked at every manuscript. I had to describe them. I had 100 words each for the book, so I had to look at every manuscript and summarize it in 100 words. Difficult. Yes?
So the collection came from a private owner?
Yes.
Is there anything known about that individual?
Yes, I will show that later. Any other questions for now? Okay. So why do I call this learned magic? Why do I call it magic after all? Is anybody of you aware that magic is a problematic term? Have you heard of definitions of magic that are problematic, that don't really work? The magic, science, religion triangle. So where's the difference between magic and religion? Where's the borderline? People falsifying the definition of the other. So there has been a long debate in the 20th century whether magic can be defined in a plausible way. And today I would say no. Magic is what I call a floating signifier. A few years ago in my PhD book, I wrote that it's an empty signifier. I wouldn't say that now, it's absurd. Magic is full of meanings, but the problem is the meaning changes according to the context. That's what a floating signifier is. It has a vague, highly variable, unspecifiable, or non-existent signified, so meaning. And they may mean different things to different people. They may stand for many or even any signifieds. They may mean whatever the interpreters want them to mean. So it's a vague, ambiguous term. But why do I use it if it's so problematic? And there were times when I said, no, let's not use it. Today I would say, we can use it under certain conditions. And I will try to explain you what are the conditions for labeling this collection to be an exemplar of learned magic. And what I will briefly outline now is a kind of a research program which I published in this article. If anybody's interested, write me an email, I can send it to you. So over the course of my research, I saw that magic cannot be defined, but it's an extremely important and popular term in Western history, from antiquity to today. So many people have used the term in different meanings. That's why it's a floating signifier. But when you kind of adopt a bird's eye perspective on the Western history, conceptual history of magic, then you will see that you can find structures and different types of discourses. And one discourse is what I call Western learned magic. And in this case, I myself do not define magic. I don't apply it in a heuristic manner or even everyday language manner. But magic, in this case, functions as a criterion to gather sources. So I take sources which include the term. Do you understand that? Okay, so in the Leipzig collection, obviously the term magic appears, yes? And in the Leipzig collection, the term appears in a self-referential manner. So what is written in these manuscripts has been labeled magic by early 18th century people. That's my criterion to label it magic, or Western learned magic, myself. There is, of course, the problem of synonymity. So you have also other terms, like in German language you have Zauberei, Hexerei, and other terms, but you can broadly understand that certain terms belong together, and this criterion works. And if you apply this criterion in a systematic manner, a coherent corpus of sources emerges from late antiquity to today, basically. So you can find text written by people who claimed to be practicing magicians and who labeled their ritual art magic in different languages. So in ancient Greek you have mageia, in Arabic you have seher, in Coptic you have hik, in Hebrew you maybe have kishuf or other terms, or apt. And so it goes on. You have Old Castilian, magia, and Latin, magia, and then other European languages. And what is striking is that this discourse belongs together, because the manuscripts wandered over time and they crossed cultural borders. They were translated into other languages. But it's always the same criterion, that we have texts that have been labeled to be magic by their authors or the scribes or the practitioners. And so when you look at this tradition or corpus of sources which emerges when you look for this criterion, you will see that, I call it Western learned magic, is a textually transmitted, learned, and rather elitist tradition, because the texts are transmitted, of ritual knowledge and theorizations. And you will also see that Western learned magic is transmitted parallel to other traditions of knowledge, mostly astrology, alchemy, Neoplatism, Kabbalah. So it's all these kind of shady underground traditions of knowledge, and magic belongs here. And what is striking, when you don't define magic, but only look at this text, you will see that this corpus is very heterogeneous. So it's not one type of rituals. It's not always using hair locks and uttering one conjuration, but it's many different types of ritual mechanics, ritual micro-techniques. The texts are very hybrid, so usually many different elements are put together, and particularly when it comes to rituals, you can use building blocks, which you kind of assemble so that the ritual becomes longer and longer. And when you write rituals down, they become longer anyway, as opposed to when you have to memorize them. And because the tradition is so old, there's a lot of changeability. So magic, in this case, changes all the time. It's not stable. There's no essence that remains the same over 2,000 years. But there is a lot of ritual dynamics. The rituals change all the time. They adapt to new contexts and, for instance, to new ideas and thoughts. To electricity, magicians use electricity. Suddenly, sexuality emerges as a ritual tool in the 19th century, not before. We don't know why, but that's how it works. So there's innovativity in magic. Things are discarded, so practitioners stop using stuff. So it's very changeable. And Western learned magic is also precarious. So there's always two sides of reception. There's rejection, so it's highly contested and disgusting, but there's also appropriation. There's fascination. There's a reason why this tradition exists, because people liked it and copied it and copied the manuscripts and tried it out. So there's always two kind of reactions in Western history. But of course, the polemical side of the story, so magical, anti-magical polemics, were so huge in Western history, and there was legislation, heavy legislation, so it was life-threatening to possess such texts and to practice the art. That's why it was an underground tradition. So there's a lot of secrecy around these texts. There are usually no author names. So people use pseudepigraphy, false author names, often of mythical character. And there is manuscript transmission. So in 1710, we have print, of course, but these are handwritten manuscripts in order to avoid attention and maybe censorship or even prosecution. So in the realm of Western learned magic, we have manuscript transmission at least until the late 19th century. And in this tradition, we have no institutionalizations. So I would basically say that this is a religious tradition. So my second order term for labeling this ritual art would be that it's a religious art, okay? It's all about spirits. It's all about God, basically. In the 18th century, it's all about you conjure spirits in the name of God. But, of course, as it was an underground tradition and prohibited and highly suppressed, there was no architecture. So there were practitioners and texts, but there were no buildings. There was no orthodoxy. There was no one who could say to the other magician, that's wrong. And others would have to follow someone's position. We can hardly reconstruct teacher-pupil relations because there are almost no ego documents. So there are not many documents of people saying, look, I tried out this, it worked well. But we only have the ritual texts which say, if you want to achieve this, do this. And that's an important difference. And we basically have no group formation. We don't know of any magical groups, let's say, before the 18th century when the whole Rosicrucian thing emerges. But that's a bit later. So this is just a brief outline so that you can get a feeling or an understanding of this tradition. Why do I call it learned? So it's texts. It's not oral. And I already said that textual rituals tend to become longer and longer. So some texts in this collection, they have like 300 pages. So if you want to perform a proper Clavicula Salomonis ritual, you have to follow so many instructions and for weeks. The longest ritual in the collection is in the Abramelin. It takes 18 months to conjure your helping angel, your holy guardian angel or so. 18 months of rituals. So you can imagine that the ritual script is necessarily quite long. And I would, as a general rule, say that this is learned because it's text-based and it leads to lengthy rituals and to complex theorizations. And you need a lot of languages. So the big four are Latin, Hebrew, Greek, and maybe a bit of Arabic, and German, of course. But when you perform the ritual and draw the ritual circle, there's no German inscribed in the circle. You need the powerful scripts. You use Latin or Greek or Hebrew. And in order to do that, of course, you need time, money, and education. That's why I call it learned. So the collector of this collection, he had money, obviously, because the collection was sold for an incredible price. And you need time to perform these rituals. It's not an easy thing. It's not 3 minutes and then you have a good harvest in summer. And you need education to read and understand the text. Any questions about Western learned magic as a category? Yes?
Why does it need to be text-based in order to be learned? Because you have magical texts which were practiced magic in the corpus of Greek magical papyri or these late tablets. These were also texts and it wasn't learned magic.
No,
practiced.
I would call this is part of the category. So the Greek magical papyri fall into my category of Western learned magic. It's the same. It's just a different epoch. It's ancient. Actually, with the Greek magical papyri, I would say that this tradition begins. The Greek magical papyri is the first corpus where you have self-proclaimed magicians, magoi, outline their ritual art. The term mageia appears 10 times in the Greek magical papyri. And that's basically where I see this tradition beginning.
But would then these late tablets be another type of magic?
It's all Western learned magic. I mean, Western is... Let's not go into detail with Western, because now we're in late ancient Egypt. But they're using Koine Greek. And what was your question again? Sorry.
I perhaps put it not in a very not very clearly, because I asked you together about these late magical tablets and magical papyri, which should be perhaps then classified as different categories.
Yeah, but that's a bit more complicated. So I would see the Greek magical papyri. You see traces of them in this collection. And you can see clear continuities from the Greek magical papyri to a corpus, to Coptic text, to Arabic text, to Jewish texts, and then to late medieval Latin texts. So there is a clear continuity. When it comes to curse tablets, it is a bit more complicated, because some of them have been written by non-professionals. So there are maybe no scripts behind that. So some tablets are derived from scripts, others not. Some were authored by professionals, maybe ritual entrepreneurs for money, okay? Others not. They were written by autodidacts, which would not claim the title magos or so. And then there are some tablets which are very easy from the perspective of ritual techniques. So just I bind, blah, blah, blah. But others, they have complicated drawings, caracteres, so they have these specialist techniques from the Greek magical papyri. So I would divide the curse tablets into maybe 2 groups. It's complicated. Yeah, okay.
But you don't see much connection to the Mesopotamian tradition.
No, there is a connection, which is also complicated. Sometimes there are like indirect influences, lines of transmission of maybe one particular god name, or I mean, we have all these voces magicae, and sometimes you have more direct transmission of texts and particular ritual techniques. So there are different levels of continuity. Yes.
Maybe I have just a practical question. How do you do it? How do you see if you're saying about those 18 months long techniques, for example, and you say those educated people or richer people, or they maybe were into those systems that, I mean, and all those complex theories behind it. So were they mainly used like with all those complex theories, whatever they are, or maybe sometimes some, let's say a rich person wants some sort of an outcome. For example, gets a book with written text what to do, not knowing any like background, any insights, just to following the script just to get to some sort of outcome, a new wife, lots of money, whatever, something like that. But how do you feel they were used? Were they used like that, or
Okay, I will go into this maybe a bit during the talk. In general, I would say that we don't know so much about the practice and the practitioners. They are still, in this time, they are still anonymous, most of them. We only have the texts. We have margins, notes on the margins. This is better than this. Oh, I tried all this, it works, blah, blah. But we don't really know the customers, for instance. We could assume that the whole royal sphere made use of this, or paid professionals to perform rituals. This is very plausible, and we have a lot of these texts sitting in royal libraries. And we have the astrologer, a figure which was more or less accepted in Europe in many royal milieus. And the astrologer is likely to not only have known and practiced astrology, but also maybe on the side also practice a bit of this.
But the astrologist, it might have been that the royal person only wants an outcome and he has a personnel to...
That's very plausible that it worked this way. The other question is, why would anyone perform an 18-month ritual? Did this ever happen? Who has the time for this? This is a bit more complicated.
In the case of the royals, of course, I would suppose there will be the choice between buying this stuff and doing it on your own or just hiring a specialist.
Yes. No, it's not the royal who would do an 18-month ritual. It would be the specialist. The specialist would do it either to be a greater magician, because once you have an own angel, then maybe you can perform quicker and more efficacious.
Very handy.
Yes. Or you get a reputation which attracts customers. I don't know how it works. We can just fantasize.
But aren't there any, well, aren't these aspects documented in the court cases, for example, about forbidden witchcraft discovered and all such? So somebody judged because they ordered a ritual and...
Yeah. So when it comes to witchcraft, I would point to the fact that this tradition here is a bit a different matter. So we have the witch hunts, the witch craze, which was basically a social phenomenon, let's say, which had devastating impact, but there was not much learned magic in that. So I would say quantitatively less than 1% of those persons who were prosecuted and whose homes were searched, they would find any texts. So this is really different thing. So this is a kind of elite discourse of ritual knowledge, which was of course also problematic, but it is maybe likely that these practitioners were more seldom subject of a charge or
Of course,
yes,
highly paying customers and all that.
yes, exactly. But let me continue. I think I will go through the history rather quick. So we know of this collection because my colleague, Daniel Benningrath, he found a selling catalogue from 1710, which lists all the manuscripts. And he thought, what's this? Do these manuscripts exist? It seems like a joke. And then we found them, and we wrote the book. And we found out a few things. So we found out that the owner was a guy called Samuel Schröer. He was simply a doctor. He was a German Paracelsian medic who had studied in Erfurt in eastern Germany and got a dissertation on opium. And we don't know much more. He's not a historical figure. And in 1710, he decided to sell these manuscripts. He had a much larger library, so he picked these out of his larger collection. He made a guy print a selling catalogue. This is the catalogus rariorum manuscriptorum. And yes, and it seems that in 1710, the whole collection was sold for 4,000 Reichsthaler. We don't really know to whom. Our guess is Heinrich Link. He was a famous apothecarian in Leipzig at that time. So he had several apothecaries, can you say that? Apotheke, yeah. Yes, so he might have bought the thing, and 4,000 Reichsthaler is a lot of money at that time. It's 2 to 3 civil houses in Leipzig, or 300,000 liters of beer. beer liters are the main measurement in this time because you can really trace beer prices quite well. And then there was censorship. So 4 years after the sale, there were some local censorship authorities, the so-called Bücherkommission. They became aware of the catalogue. And then they said, what's this? We can't accept this. They controlled bookshops and interrogated some booksellers. And the catalogues were confiscated. The trade with the manuscript was forbidden, but they couldn't identify the buyer, and they couldn't locate the manuscripts. That's what we can see in the files of this case, because they still sit there in the library of Dresden. After 1710, some things are unclear. So we don't know who the buyer was. If it was Heinrich Link, he died in 1717. And then the collection was handed down eventually by the heirs of this person who died to the Ratsbibliothek. And the Ratsbibliothek later changed into the Stadtbibliothek, and then it was moved in 1962 from the Stadtbibliothek to the University Library, where it is today. And there's a first catalogue of these manuscripts from 1838 by some guy in the Stadtbibliothek in the city library who catalogized them. But surprisingly, no one was really aware of the collection until very recently. In German, we have this discipline called Volkskunde, so folklore studies, which is basically extinct today. So there's no more professor of this. But there were famous ones in the 20th century, and no one was aware of this collection, even though it's really important. And all the manuscripts have been digitized in 2011. So if you want to see them, you can look them up in the online system of the Leipzig University Library. What is the prehistory of this collection? The bulk of these manuscripts were copied, translated into German around 1700. There are 13 Italian and 10 Latin manuscripts, which may be older. Also, some German ones may be older. This pertains to the manuscripts. The texts are much older, of course. So we have a Liber Rasieles. You may never have heard of all these text names, but they are kind of the who is who in the grimoire history, okay? So they are all there. The Liber Rasieles is a Latin version of the Sefer HaRazim, which is in late ancient Jewish text. We have a version of the Testamentum Salomonis, which is also late ancient. We have some handwritten copies of previously printed texts, for instance, of Andreas Lupius, Peter Kreutzer, Abraham Frankenberg. So these are basically astrologers of the time. And we have a few Paracelsian manuscripts, a Vademecum, which is like a doctor's handbook. And so there are a few author names where you can date more precisely. Yeah, that's kind of the prehistory. Apart from that, we don't really know where they come from. They're just there. Any questions? Okay, let's look at the contents. First of all, I told you magic has to appear in a text in order for me to identify it as a text of Western world magic. And in fact, magic, including Latin, Italian magia, and German Zauber, appears on 42 of 140 title pages. And if one includes synonyms, some examples are here: secreta, so secrets, mystica, occulta, miracula, Kabbalah. They were all synonyms of the time of magic. This figure rises to some 100 manuscripts, and if you go into the text, you basically have magic everywhere. So I would say the criterion works. Because these texts were interpreted and classified as magic by contemporaneous writers and practitioners. I already said that 170 manuscripts are written in German, 13 in Italian, and 10 in Latin, but in fact most are mixed texts. So usually you have, if you have a German text, you still have Latin headlines or special formulations which are still in Latin, and you also have Hebrew, Greek, and some Arabic elements. And I already said that the vernacularization of magic is obviously earlier than we thought, and here, this is how we construed the catalogue. So this is the title on the, this is the title on the catalogue. This is how many pages. Drawings included, yes. And here we have hierarchized the languages. So German, Latin, title, content, blah, blah, blah. Just for you to get an idea how we did that. So I already said that the collection hosts ancient, medieval, and early modern texts of learned magic, and that it is a continuous textual ritual tradition. But we also have innovations and adaptations of the 17th century. So there's some Rosenkreuzer stuff in there. We have a lot of magia naturalis, which was kind of an invention of the 15th century. So the idea that the nature is magical, no spirits, but the stone has a power which I can use, or the stars have power which I can use, without the necessity of addressing a spirit with an own intelligence. So you can directly influence nature. That was the idea of magia naturalis. There's also the Passauer Kunst, which emerged during the 30 Years' War. So many soldiers had sigils on their bodies, which made them invulnerable. That's called Passauer Kunst. And then there are a few texts which are obviously inventions of the 17th century, like Abramelin. And we have some early Enlightenment arguments and a lot of Paracelsianism. So now let's look in greater detail at the rituals. I already said that Western learned magic is heterogeneous and hybrid, so it is not one ritual technique. I differentiate ritual mechanics, ritual technique, and ritual goals. Ritual mechanics are kind of the explanation why a ritual works. So if I do a demon conjuration, I would say the ritual works because the demon made the effect of the ritual. The demon represents the efficacy. The ritual techniques are drawing the circle, candles, fumigations, sigils, conjurations, a lot of micro techniques. And the ritual goals are the goals of the whole thing. Yes. And I will start with ritual mechanics. So I already said that 90 of 140 manuscripts focus on conjuration or conjuring spirits. Obviously, this is one particular type of interpreting how magic works, namely that we address wishes to spirits or higher beings, which kind of make them become true. And there are basically all classics of the pre-modern conjuring spirits art in this collection. Sefer Harazim, Almandal, Ars Notoria, Liber Urota Sonori, a lot of Clavicula Salomonis, Heptameron, Abertel, Abramelin, and a genuinely German genre called Höllenzwang, so hell. What's Zwang? I don't know. To force someone. So, forcing hell. Yes, but there is not only conjuring spirits, but there's also magia naturalis. So, circa 20 manuscripts are about stones, using the power of the stars and other natural powers. Then there are a few manuscripts with Kabbalah, Kabbalistic contents. Who has an understanding of what Kabbalah is? Okay, so very briefly, Kabbalah is a lot about, so it's like the Jewish mystical tradition, but here it's rather practical Kabbalah. So it's a ritual art focused on numberology, so transforming letters into numbers and vice versa, and kind of using these correlations. Also with regard to angels or angelology, so you have complex hierarchies of angels which you can instrumentalize. And then we have the image of the tree of life and the sphirot, the 10 branches of the tree of life, which are kind of the godly way of creating the world by emanating itself. And you can also use this in magic. Then there are manuscripts which only work by drawing sigils and using them in certain situations. I will show a few examples later. And there are a few manuscripts which only work through uttering voces magicae, so weird words which have no apparent meaning, or writing down weird scripts, caracteres. It's kind of the magical script of that time. And you can write down things in this weird script and then something happens. And then there are a few manuscripts which work with artifacts. So you can melt your own golden invisibility ring, or a coin that you can spend 3 times a day and it always wanders back into your pocket, and some strange stones which you produce yourself by chemical procedures, and you have a lot of amulets. So it's really many different types of how this works. It's not a single tradition. And when it comes to ritual goals, there's also a plurality of different goals. There's a lot of treasure hunting. So treasure hunting, finding treasures by means of conjuring demons was big in the early modern Europe. Also detecting lost things or detecting thieves by means of rituals. Divination rituals, obviously, is also very present in this collection. We have a lot of protection rituals, invulnerability. So this is where the soldiers come into play as potential customers. We only have 2 times the ritual script which shows how to raise your soul to God or rise through the planetary spheres. This is kind of a marginal idea in the history of Western magic at the time, that the magician becomes God. But there are hardly any ritual scripts which show how to do it. And here are 2, which is earlier than we thought so far. We actually thought it begins later in the 19th century or so. There are a lot of miracles, so invisibility, flying is all over the place, and money materialization. So spirits just bring you bottles of money. We have that a few times. And then there are more specific techniques. So we have 10 manuscripts which show how to trap a spirit in a glass, which is handy because you can ask the spirit a lot of things, and it always gives you the right answer. We have quite a few magical ring production manuals, and other manuals use wax figurines. That's also important. When we look at the conjuring addresses, we have a long list of different spirits, depending on the script, on the manual. So we have demons, a lot of demons, including Satan, Beelzebub, but in this case they are only demons as part of many other demons. We have angels, we have planetary spirits, we have zodiacal spirits, so spirits ascribed to the 12 signs. We have spirits ascribed to the deacons. Who knows what the deacons are? Okay, the deacons are ascribed to 10 degrees of the zodiac. The signs are ascribed to 30 degrees. That's why we have 12 signs. but you can make this smaller. So every 10 degrees begins a new decan, basically every 10 days. And when you make it even more smaller, you have 1 degree spirits. Basically, each day a new spirit.
Deacons could be also like a named spirit or some kind of. What would be an example of a deacon?
So there are many different lists with different names. In general, there are 36 deacons. And it's just when the zodiac wanders along the sky, every 30 degrees it enters a new sign. But deacons are not so well known.
But you can have like an entity deacon.
It's actually not entities, it's just star constellations which are around the zodiac, like the signs. They are star constellations around the zodiac. And the deacons are also star constellations, but then they are spiritualized, so they are turned into spirits, and the spirits get a name, and then you can address the spirit. That's the logic.
No. Thank you.
Have you read Theologian, Goethian manuscripts? I divide Goethian Theologian manuscripts of Conjuring.
I don't understand the question, excuse me.
This debate.
Yeah.
Goethian conjures and
Goethian?
Theologian, yes.
And what?
Theologian.
Theologian.
Theologian. Theologian.
Theurgian.
Theologian?
Ah, you mean Goetia and Theurgia?
Is classified?
No, those are modern categories. They are not 18th century categories. The Goetia is a specific text which is not part of this collection, but basically all the other Solomonic grimoires are. And theurgy appears sometimes as a category in the texts, yes, but they are not sharply distinguished. Yeah. Anyway, there are other spirits, local or earth spirits, spirits of the 4 cardinal directions, spirits ascribed to the elements, spirits ascribed to the seasons, spirits of the dead. There's a weird creature called Pygmy, which protects the treasure. There is one genuine manual how you can marry a nymph. So this is one of the elementary spirits, which is a fascinating recipe and ritual, I can tell you.
You try.
No, it's too hot. Okay, so now a few examples. These I find most fascinating because they are so short and they are aiming at miracles. So it's not do this and you will have luck in your future. This you can attribute this, and you can always you can avoid falsification easily. But when the ritual says do this and you will fly, it's not so easy to explain misfortune or the failure of the ritual, because either it works or not. That's why I find these interesting. So, for instance, this is for an invisibility coat. No, wait, sorry. This is for a flying coat. So you need these caracteres, and you sew them into your coat. You do a brief ritual during the night in a wood, and then you can sit on the coat with your friends. Apparently it's a huge coat, it has to be a huge coat, and fly around. And you have to conjure a few princes which kind of animate the coat. So it's the princes who make the coat fly. But either it works or not. This is also interesting. You can build 7-league boots, shoes with which you can walk fast. And it's not a conjuration. You only need new leather boots and have to produce these lamens made of Blei. Oh God. A very simple. What are the curse tablets made of? Hmm?
Did you mean the material?
Yes, the material. Hmm?
Would it be laid?
Laid? Laid. Well, it's a very easy to use metal. Yeah. Hmm? Blei. Hmm. Anyway, you make these thin. These are the inscription, some archangel names, and that's it. And then you can start walking. You only have to put your scarf like this so that it's not the air is not so cold. That's what's written in the manuscript. This is also fascinating Italian ritual, how to get an invisibility coat by making this pane pizza. So you use dough and do some manipulations, and then a black man comes and gives you the coat. And Marco Pasi, who was here, some of you have seen him, he says that it's the earliest instance of the word pizza in an Italian manuscript, which he knows. Then this is one of these invulnerability seals, which you can sew into your clothes, and then nothing will happen to you in a battle, for instance. This is a recipe of how to produce this ducat, this coin, which comes into your pocket 3 times a day. It comes back into your pocket, so you can spend it 3 times and it always comes back. And this is a sigil which you can hold against the storm, and then it will just turn the other way. Any questions? Okay. Some more impressions. So, just, this is it's a lot of stuff, it's complicated. Just a few three more impressions from the manuscripts. These are ritual tools, knives, and swords, which you need in the conjuring demons art. This is taken from a Clavicula Salomonis. And this is another version. You also have to, it's kind of complicated to produce these things. You have to ritually manipulate them and inscribe all sorts of angel names and caracteres on top. And this is a belt. You can produce your belt, which protects you during the conjuration. These are some of the lists of the spirits. So here you have Beelzebub, and here you have the description of each spirit, what it's responsible for. And you have the sigil, which you have to produce beforehand, because with a sigil and with a name, you can control the spirit. And the sigil also protects you from the spirit. And there are others, more complicated spirits, sigils, depending on the spirit. This is an example of one of these ritual circles. Here you maybe see the magician, the practitioner, a helper figure. Here you have the illustrations of the circle. And this is taken from one of the Höllenzwänge, from these German type manuals. This is a very complex sigil, which you need for treasure hunting. So with these sigils you can detect treasures. These are lists of voces magicae, of these names which you recite during the conjurations. And you have shortcuts so that you can more easily memorize them, because usually you would have to memorize the stuff before doing the ritual. You can't start conjuring a demon and then the demon appears and then, oh wait, I have to look something up. Because if you do, the demon will just do whatever he or she wants with you. And this is written in the manuscripts, that you have to be very careful, you have to know the stuff by heart. And there are also drawings of the demons. This is a drawing of Mephisto. So you have the figure, which was later then used by Goethe in Faust. You have it appearing in these manuscripts. This is one of the glasses into which you can trap spirits. This is a manual for trapping spirits. And you have secret scripts. So one manuscript in the collection has, I think, 64 of these different scripts listed, which is absolutely unique. I've never seen that. So we know of these scripts, but we didn't know that there were so many. And in fact, there are some manuscripts written entirely in such script. Not in the Leipzig collection, but there's one in Kassel, which is completely written in one of these scripts. It's not so hard to decode. It is, in fact, it has been... Yeah.
Like the same number of the I Ching.
Of the what?
The octograms of I Ching.
Okay.
Well, they're connecting that. Lately, talking about these questions.
Yeah. Okay, let's think about that. Yes, anyway. And this is a unique genre in the collection. There are like 10 manuscripts which only show how to produce these planetary sigils. So you produce the sigil. These are two sides of the sigil. It's the sigil of Mars. And we have a numerological square, characteres. This is probably Mars. And so you can attract Mars energy or whatever you want to do with it. Then there's also dream divination. You put this under your pillow when you go to bed. And when you pose a question, you get the answer in your dream. And there are quite a few recipes, really complicated alchemical stuff of how to produce divinatory mirrors. So you have the mirror and you have to inscribe stuff on the back of the mirror so that it works, so that you can see the future or hidden things or distant things with the mirror. And finally, some drawings of these very interesting rings, which are also a bit complicated to produce. Usually you need gold, and with this one you can make a woman fall in love with you. Yes, and that's a beautiful fold-out drawing of the Tree of Life, also in one of the Kabbalistic manuscripts in the collection. So I will come to my conclusions, and instead of providing some answers or summarizing something, I will pose a few questions which interest myself. So I think, particularly in such large collections, the heterogeneity of the ritual techniques and the multiplicity of recipes is puzzling to me. So if you put yourself into the practitioner's shoe and have so many texts, so many different possibilities to pursue a specific goal, how do you know which one is the right one or the most efficacious one? How did these people decide which one to use? Was it purely pragmatic, or did they hierarchize the different techniques? We don't know. There are no traces of this in the texts. But I think I would be puzzled with so many different possibilities. And also, in such a collection, you have many different versions of the same text or the same rite. There are 7 versions of the Clavicula Salomonis, which all differ more or less severely.
But they were so approachable to the same ring of people, or how did they like spread out? Maybe one version was some part of Europe and another.
I mean, it depends on the context. So in the early 18th century, these texts have become collectors' gadgets.
Yeah.
So there were even book hunters which were looking for these scarce, unusual manuscripts. So there were collectors who were just collecting these manuscripts and putting them in their shelf and showing them to friends and, wow, curiositas. But this guy, Samuel Schröer, he was a practitioner. He was a Paracelsian medic, and we know that Paracelsian medics at that time, they used all sorts of stuff. And they also engaged with this Solomonic art of conjuring spirits, and they were very open when it comes to using stuff for healing purposes. Yes, so in the texts themselves, usually there is the definite call that you have to perform the ritual precisely in the way in which it is written down. That's what I call ritual formalism. But when you have so many different versions, and each one has to be like correct or performed in the exact way, then this is kind of contradictory. Can they all be true at the same time? Or does it matter at all? I don't know. And what do we do with these short recipes, with these miraculous goals? So in the magic debate, the modern magic debate in scholarship, there's the big idea of immunity to falsification. Magic is so durable and so constant in human history because practitioners usually avoid falsification. They perform a ritual, and if something happens, they attribute it to the ritual. If nothing happens, they would say, I did a mistake. I performed the ritual wrong, or I wasn't focused enough, or other people performed counter-rituals. So there are always explanations of why a ritual does not work. And this is called immunity to falsification. That's why people continue to believe in magic, even though they sometimes have problems with success, with ritual success. But in this case, we have very short recipes, so only like 3 minor things to do, and a very promising outcome. Invisibility, flying. How did these people cope with the lack of effect, and how did they explain the failing of the ritual? Or would they assume that this is just fantasy, a fantasy element in these texts? That's what my colleague Marco Franczkowski says, that some of these rituals have been taken serious and they have been performed, and others were rather the miraculous fantasy side of the story. Oh, cool, a recipe for becoming invisible. But the people thought, no, it's not going to work. I'm not even going to try it out. But I think every script that is there because people have tried it out and have written it down. The stuff that does not work or that is not tried out is not written down. It does not endure over time. It's a hypothesis. I can be wrong. But this is, in fact, it's not literature made for entertainment, okay? It's pure underground practitioner literature. It's very dangerous to transmit these things. So I think that everything has been practiced or tried out. And so I wondered whether ritual success or failure did have an impact on the transmission of the text at all. That's a question which I cannot answer, but maybe you can. So I invite you to help me. Thank you.
So, any more questions?
Yes.
Actually, I was thinking about which trials that were performed in early times, but could you find any parallels in these manuscripts with witch trials, whether somebody was treated for performing kind of the same ritual maybe in early times?
I did not understand the question. Can someone help me?
It's
Strauss? What?
I mean, if we're talking about parallels, like textual parallels or parallels in rituals that might be performed in earlier times. So
In earlier times?
yeah, and if we take witch trials. So
Witch trials?
Yeah, witch trials. So maybe somebody was accused of kind of the same magic
Mhm.
things as are present in these manuscripts.
So the question is whether there are parallels in the witch trials
Yeah.
which with this collection or with these types of texts.
In this collection.
In this collection. In this collection. Okay. So there is a connection. There is a connection. I already said that there are different discourses of magic at that time. Let's say broadly there are 4 different discourses. There is the polemical, anti-magical discourse by the theologians who think it's all extremely devilish and needs to be prosecuted. Then there is the Magia Naturalis discourse. So there was an elite discourse about legitimate magic, still in the 18th century, by humanist scholars, which were not so much affected by this anti-magical polemical discourse. Then there's a third category, which is more or less this stuff, which is underground literature, very practical and clearly illegitimate. And then there is a fourth discourse, which is the witchcraft discourse. And I already said it's weird that positive discourses, negative discourses exist at the same time, and that like this practical stuff exists at the same time that so many people are prosecuted, or have been prosecuted a bit earlier during the witch trials. And in fact, it's really different historical layers, because most of the people who were kind of prosecuted during the witch persecution, I mean, it's a long history starting maybe in 1450 until around 1700, with maybe roughly 60,000 people died in the end, and maybe 75% women. But most of these people are not of this learned type, only a very small percentage. And they're not participating in the humanist Magia Naturalis discourse. So this is really a social bottom-up phenomenon, which is driven by these theological stereotypes, the so-called cumulative idea of witchcraft with 5 elements, maleficium, and demon pact, demon sex, basically sex, with incubi and succubi. Then the meeting on the witch Sabbath, so the meeting of the witches. Yes, and and some of the things that were accused to people that got into these legislative trials, some of the things you can find in the collection. For instance, this penny, which comes back into your pocket, it's called Wechseltaler at that time in the German-speaking Europe. And sometimes it appears in the trials that someone offered a Wechseltaler to someone else. So like practical, everyday ritual magic, but we didn't never have scripts for that. We thought it's maybe a fantasy, or just someone claimed, hey, this penny comes back into your pocket 3 times a day. How would you claim so? But now we have a 5-page script of how to do it. So there are some connections, and there's a lot of also regarding treasure hunting. So in the Leipzig collection we have a lot of manuals for treasure hunting, but we also have lists of places where you can find treasures. They're called Walenbücher. And this is also like a folk thing at that time, which kind of entered the witch trials. But yeah. So there are some indirect connections, but in general I would say that this is more or less different social strata and different phenomena with interrelations.
Any more questions?
I have a question about those miraculous simple recipes. Wouldn't there have been a concept of the person of the practitioner also being important, in the sense that if a learned practitioner who already has a lot of experience does it, then it works, but if a complete layperson does it, there is something missing? Or was it just technical that whoever does it, it doesn't need no skills or background or no, I don't know, powers from the person?
So I would say in general that this is an art that claims to be effective, independent of the person. So when you know the manual, anyone can do it, independent of personal, I don't know, talent or even, I don't know, birth aspects. So it's kind of the claim that there are techniques which allow anyone to perform certain goals. But of course, in the texts themselves, it is stressed very often that you have to be very careful, that you have to do a lot of training to be successful. And in fact, for the longer conjuration procedures, you literally have to train beforehand a lot to do everything smoothly in a flow during the ritual. You cannot dilettantly stumble into this. You have to prepare yourself. And I would also assume that there was, in these shady social milieus, of which we have almost no historical traces, there will certainly have been practitioners who had a higher reputation because they were more experienced, because other people said that he's really good, he's performing for a long time, and other people are rather the newbies. I don't know. We don't have so many information about how this really worked on a social sphere.
I was just wondering if you could explain why this doesn't work. Like, you know, but you are not actually, you haven't practiced enough, you can't work when you do it, like Invisibility Coat or something like that.
No, I wouldn't say. I would say the idea is that it should work when you practice enough. There are some rituals in this art which kind of make the magician better. Like this 18-month Abramelin ritual. When you have this angel at your side, or when other people also think or know that you have it, you are probably deemed more efficacious. Or, I mean, it might even be the case that you don't even have to perform rituals anymore. You just call the angel, and the angel does the thing. That's a pattern that you can find in some of the rituals from antiquity onwards. It's like a shortcut.
Well,
It's even in the Greek magical papyri, the paredros.
Are the angelic services described there? Are the angelic services described in the manuscript?
Yeah, sometimes. It can perform all the miracles, the stuff, yes. I mean, it can do it anyway, but in this case, it's like, so you make a lengthy procedure, then you have the spirit, and it helps you to be faster in future. It's like an investment. So this exists. Yeah, anyway, sorry.
Keep having pauses and wondering.
Yeah.
I got confused.
One last question. To continue with the same theme, and you had this one of the questions that how did they came through with the lack of the effects or something, but probably, it's, as with other stuff, some part can be like illusionary, some part like this placebo effect in some sense. But if you have a practitioner working for you or for somebody, maybe even selling this service, right? So it's in their interest to make it look like it works. So probably they have all kind of systems as high as they can go with it, And maybe with the placebo system, it's always so that something is working. Maybe if I'm after a new spouse, it happens next week, and I think that it worked.
Yeah, that's attribution. So you make the ritual, you wait, you observe,
and maybe
if something good happens, you attribute the event to the ritual.
But when you asked this question, I already thought about it at this moment, that why do you ask this, that do you have any information that there is like a lack of these effects, or is it only like a human common mind that sees it like that? Or why do you ask this question?
Yeah, because I'm amazed by these claims. I mean, I'm not so much amazed by a general religious claim that God exists. Okay. Interesting, yeah, could be or could not be. But in this case, you have a much more specific claim. You do something and something happens. And so what happens when 100 people try it out and it never works, or sometimes it works? How does it work? I mean, I just find that interesting. Also, in order to explain why this exists and why it exists for such a long time, and why people make these efforts.
But even like this modern world, David Copperfield, millions of people really, believing like him making a train disappear or whatever, moon from the sky.
Yeah, but in this case, they look for the trick.
Yeah.
It's different logic. So stage magic is entertainment. Based on the general assumption that it's all a trick.
I've seen an interview with Copperfield where he said that he has been approached by people who believe that they can cure his children from incurable diseases. So
I know people who think that what he does is real. That it's not like black magic, it's not illusionary, but he really has a connection to the others first. Some people, he doesn't have to say that, but people believe.
I mean, there's also a complex historical relationship between stage magic and this stuff, the real magic. It kind of accumulates in the 19th century where stage magic really gets off. But where do they have the ideas from? I mean, and still today I talk to stage magicians, and there is still kind of always this gray area of, even among the stage magicians themselves, with some kind of occult interests and keeping certain questions open. But of course, there's the show element, and you need to play with the idea that it could be real. And I mean that then the audience, some people in the audience think, oh wow, this is real. I mean that's very basic, original religious thinking that miracles exist. It's age old. So it all conflates.
Okay, one last question.
It's very quick. Due to the fact that we've never seen how these people perform the visuals, and we've never seen the outcome of
Well, in the 18th century.
Yes.
Tomorrow I will present stuff that we can look at.
Yes. So my question is that I'm 100% sure that these things that they have written down in these rituals, that you have to take it word by word, literally, or is there a chance that something you must take like metaphorically, and if you're not inside this some kind of circle, then it's not a thing that you should do or you have to do. So what was like what was the reason why those people wrote down these texts? What was like their motive for that? That everybody can become invincible. What was it like?
Okay, first of all, it's a practical art based on recipes, which exists for a long time. So at some point, you personally enter this domain, and you need recipes to start practicing, received by your mentors, or you buy them. Yeah, and people write, I mean, we don't know when a new script is originally invented or written down the first time. So what we have here is all copies. It's all copied all the time. And when you copy something, you always change it. And we know that in the early 18th century, but this is a genuinely late, early modern phenomenon, which is not the same in the 14th or 15th century. In the 18th century, we have book hunters and a collecting fable. And we know that some people wrote down one Clavicula Salomonis after the other and just sold them for money, because they knew they would find buyers. We have traces of that. And accusations, oh, this guy, he only writes Clavicula Salomonis for money. But the practitioners, this is literature written from practitioner to practitioner. There's no other purpose than that.
There are copies of the Pope Honorio Primorio?
Yeah, but that's... no, it's not there, no.
So I think we can conclude for today. We're going to continue tomorrow.